everybody. This is Dr. Emily Scherning with American Resiliency, here with an up-to-date climate outlook for all of our friends in Wyoming. In our first round of state-level videos, Wyoming surprised me with its dangerously intense high change outlook. And I delivered that video with a certain tone of apology. I never like giving bad news. All the comments and emails I received from people in Wyoming were like, bring it. It's an attitude I admire. But the whole experience made it clear to me that I didn't really get Wyoming or understand how wild Wyoming is at baseline. So this is another video where a regular volunteer in Colorado helped fill me in on what it's like out there on the ground. And let me say, learning about Wyoming's baseline climate let me understand that I am not tough and that the climate is very pleasant and high. So since like 8 people live in Wyoming, I'm going to share some of our research volunteers' top Wyoming facts with the rest of you all before we get going, so we're all on the same page. First off, record temp range, minus 63 to 116. From a gardener's perspective, in Cheyenne, the southernmost city in Wyoming, the growing season is at most 4 months long. So pretty much what you're going to be able to eat local there is beef. Across Wyoming, it's super windy all the time, and much of the state is sagebrush steppe, which looks like this. You can see there how much of Wyoming is covered by this, and that it's a beautiful environment and a forbidding environment. Challenging environment with a low population density, except according to our research volunteer of these guys. I don't know if you have any jackalope experience. I remember running into jackalopes for the first time at Waldrug as a kid on the way to Yellowstone on a family trip. But more seriously, in Wyoming, this is the only joke the harsh landscape can support. But only kid people of Wyoming, because it's clear y'all could beat me up. So let's see how spicy Wyoming is looking in the NCA5 projections. And before we get going, I just want you to know where I'm getting my source material. That's primarily from the 5th National Climate Assessment. When I'm pulling up figures, I'm going to tell you the number of the figure, and you can find them if you go to chapters and down to all figures. You'll find that they're downloadable. I also sometimes use information that I get from the NCA Climate Atlas. And because these are publicly available data sets, they are what power our volunteer-created AR tools. These tools help us visualize side by side more than one temperature point above baseline. It's worth noting we are currently at 1.5 C, as we can see here in the monthly average data that's coming out of the Copernicus Institute, which is the European Union's climate outfit. So this is a high quality source. I'll be keeping an eye out for the June update to see where we are. In May of 2024, we were 1.52 C over the pre-industrial baseline, and you can see that we have been at or above 1.5 for quite a while now, in a very significant difference from what we might have expected. Thinking more about that difference, we used to think, the consensus science used to think that we'd be looking at regularly hitting 2C above pre-industrial baseline by about 2050. But with us hitting 1.5 C now, which we weren't expecting for another 10 years, it's clear that there's a probability the timeline has changed. I used to talk about 2050 in my climate forecasts. Now I'm using 2C. If your state was processed before I made this changeover, you should know that in the federal documents, mid-century is equivalent to 2C of warming projections. 5th National Climate Assessment data and figures are an extremely valuable resource. Other countries don't have this level of fine-grained data, and they represent the highest consensus climate science available for our country. It's worth noting your tax dollars paid for the development and review of the 5th National Climate Assessment, and you deserve access to the information in this document. But as a matter of congressional mandate, there's no direct federal funding for communication to the public about the National Climate Assessment. This made me so mad I founded American Resiliency in 2021. We're the only nonprofit focused on communicating this important information to the public, and we run on your donations. Thanks for sticking through the preamble. Let's go over and look at our first figure. All right, here we are in figure 1.14, looking at national overview for changes at 2C. You can see Wyoming, you're largely in Utah's ominous high change blob. I'm going to be working to understand what's going on in Utah next. Utah's going to be coming out next week on the 4th of July. Wyoming, from this figure, you can see you're looking at a total warm up around the year of 4 to 6 degrees F. Let's get a better idea of what that really means and jump over to figure 2.11, where we'll start talking about changes to seasonal extremes. Wow. So, all right, at a glance, this is a really interesting picture. First off, good news. Look over here. You've got basically no increase in warm nights. We're talking about even in the lowlands, in lower elevation areas, at most a handful of additional nights over 70 a year. So even though we're looking at some real increases in hot days, in days over 95, you're still cooling down well at night. Let's talk more about that daytime heat up. To look at the hot day increase, we're going to go over to an AR tool because while you might think 2.11 that shows days over 95, it's misleading. The legend on that NCA5 figure is misleading because it doesn't incorporate additional days over 100 or additional days over 105. But those data sets are publicly available, and we've combined them in this American Resiliency tool to visualize your true total heat up. And you'll notice at a glance that Wyoming doesn't look too bad at 2C. But if we pan over, we can see that some of these easternmost counties get significant heat ups, 25, 19, 29 days additional over 95, with about half of those coming in at over 100. We're looking relatively good in Wyoming and on the key here, in good part because of the dramatic hot season increases we're seeing in some parts of the country. 3-month hot season increases projected for parts of Texas at 2C, and for much of North Texas and Oklahoma, we're talking about 2 months. So zooming in here, we do see Wyoming looking nice and cool at 2C by comparison. And I think that many of us will be comforted to see, those of us from out of state, that the counties where the national parks are looking at very limited additional days over 95. We can hope for continued health from this piece of information in those wonderful lands there. In Wyoming, if you live at lower elevation, you should be expecting at least a 3-week hot season heat up. We got to remember though, you looked good for nighttime cooling. So even though we're seeing an increase in Wyoming around your wet bulb risk, around your risk of potentially dangerous heat, with the biggest risk increases around the eastern edge of the state, because you still have access to that nighttime cooling, it means that passive cooling solutions are going to be very applicable to almost everyone in Wyoming. With good natural nighttime cooling, even if your state is impacted by a major utility failure, people can pull through a hot day if they have the opportunity to cool down at night. And in Wyoming, you all seem like the type to be able to plan for this sort of challenge. It's cold now. Let's go back to 2.11. Zooming in here on Wyoming, we do see a very serious loss of cold in the state, centered in the tallest mountains, most centered in the Tetons. That's looking at about a month of cold loss of days under 32. But even in areas where that's fairly mild, we're still talking about 3 weeks less of winter. The other peak for cold loss is right here in the Bighorns. That secondary cold loss peak is just south of Medicine Wheel. And if you haven't heard of Medicine Wheel, this is an important sacred site. More than 7,000 years of continuous human worship, and it's an incredible sacred site. It's very much worth visiting, one of the most incredible places in North America. In the parts of the Bighorns where you can find Medicine Wheel, about 25 days of cold loss are projected. If you look back at those heat maps, you'll see that this part of the Bighorns does look to be fairly safe from serious summer heat increases. So getting back to business, we know we're looking at highly variable cold loss across the state, worst in the high mountains, but even in the low elevation areas, we're still looking at about 3 weeks of cold loss. So that's duration of the winter. I bet you are also more interested in the projected changes in cold intensity, since this is a snowpacked state. Let's look at cold intensity changes in 11.3. Here in 11.3, we can look at projected changes in cold intensity through the lens of plant hardiness zones. This figure is obviously too big for us to really see what's going on. I'm going to go to some SNPs in a minute, but I wanted you to see where they came from, and I want you to see that even further out than we're looking, even as we look towards 3C maybe, Wyoming's mountains look likely to be able to hold snowpack, and that is a change. This is an improvement that we're seeing at 3 and at 2 for Wyoming. Let's go to the SNPs. Okay, so this is a big change now that we're zooming in on Wyoming, but it's not too bad. This is actually a milder rate of winter change than we saw for Wyoming in the NCA4 projections. Across the NCA5, there's been sort of a general theme that the middle of the country has kind of tightened up, looking more resilient, looking better than it did in the NCA4. However, along the northern coasts, especially, we're seeing more challenging conditions projected in the NCA5 than the NCA4. Let's talk about what these winter figures mean here for Wyoming. A few areas you're looking at a big shift. Along the eastern edge of the state, particularly, we see some of the most pronounced changes. That's up to a 15-degree lift in the lows. But some of the state, it's as low as a 5-degree lift in winter lows, and much of the state, it's about 10, which is pretty typical across the nation. I can't tell you how grateful I am to see these more conserved winter lows projected for your high mountains, and that the margins around them, the margins around the peaks, also look more conserved. So there's a lot more potential from this figure for hopeful snowpack conservation. And with the low summer change projected for those mountain areas, that's very hopeful that we're going to see some potential for stabilization of the hydrology of all of the great rivers where the headwaters are in Wyoming. It's just a blessing, really, this improvement in the Wyoming winter projections. Bighorns, you're probably getting the sense I got my eye on you. I'd like to make a special note. We're seeing just a 5-degree lift projected in the winter lows for the bighorns. Let's talk water. Let's get eyes on the projected changes to the snowpack. And before I show you the projections, I want to show both folks in Wyoming and the rest of us that due to your wildly intense hydrology, Wyoming has special federal resources to help keep track of potential flooding from snowmelt or sudden to disastrous changes in your contemporary precipitation-related experience. There's a lot of cool stuff on this page, and I went through all the tools, and they work great. Therefore, today, they're for contemporary stuff. Looking at the future in precipitation, we're going to go and look at figure 2.10 from the NCA5. We see much more rain falling over the Shoshone National Forest in this figure. The rest of the state, we've got crosshatching, and that means statistically significant more rain coming to Wyoming. About 5% more rain coming to much of the state, more like 10% more rain falling over Shoshone National Forest. In terms of extreme storms, let's go over to figure 2.12, where you'll see we're projecting some extreme spiciness. 2.12 is another one of those giant figures that can be potentially hard to read. But if we zoom in on Wyoming, and I've looked across all three of these, there's pretty conserved intense spiciness both in the northwest corner of the state and in the southeast corner of the state. We've seen some incredible flooding from the Yellowstone River in the last few years. It does seem likely in the projections that it will only be increasingly intense, with the occasional megastorm dropping in there. Your biggest storms projected by 2C could have an incredible 40% more rain per storm than we're used to seeing. So maintaining that infrastructure in the Wyoming mountains is going to be a challenge and a half, that's for sure. Infrastructure issues in that area have made the national news just recently with the Teton Pass collapse. You can see that the sort of infrastructure failure that we can have in this rugged terrain does not look easy to repair. So now I've moved us over to figure 4.3, where we can see the change in the rain in inches. And that lets us see where the most rain is projected to be falling. Not necessarily in extreme storms. We didn't see a lot of conserved extreme storm signals here, where most of the rain is going to be falling in terms of average annual inches. And this is over the Wind River Reservation. I don't know if that's good, if that would be good for the landscape, or if it would mean more flooding or what. I would love to hear from a voice on the ground there, and let me know what you think. But here's where the big issue is. In 4.5, figure 4.5 here, we got one of the most important figures for the mountain states in the whole national climate assessment. And this was really upsetting when we looked at Washington, at Oregon, at California, to see the difference in inches in their snow water equivalent. And here, this is where we see some additional strength potential for Wyoming snowpack. We see limited decreases that in most cases are going to be largely made up for by increased inches of rain in Wyoming. Unfortunately, here we do see some focus of potential drying in bighorns and Tetons. It's not as serious, it's not as cataclysmic as the loss of snow water that is not being made up for by precipitation in northern Idaho, but it is meaningful. And it makes me suspect more fire danger for the bighorns is in store than I would like. Let's go over to the fire map. That's going to be figure 7.4. So 7.4 here, this figure is hard to read. Give yourself some time with it. Let yourself process what both maps mean. But baseline, what you need to see here is that the highest fire danger increase is falling over the bighorns in Wyoming. We're talking about like a 350% increase in risk for days where a large fire would be possible. You can see across the state, you're not looking as bad as like your neighbor to the north, Montana, in terms of fire risk. I want to pop back to figure 4.5, where you can see that bad patch at the Idaho-Montana border that is correlated to some of this highest regional increase in fire danger. For most of Wyoming, you've got about a 200% increase in risk for fire, about a 200% increase in days when the conditions are ripe for a large fire. Wildfires like that, they haven't been so common in Wyoming as in other places, but it's not like you're strangers to fire. And you all know, I'm sure, about the pine beetle spreading and killing forests throughout the West. We can't know for sure if that threat's going to come to Wyoming mountains or not, even though your summer cool preservation looks pretty good and it looks like you're getting more water. Fellow national park fans, I tell you all, we just need to look at figure 4.5 to see the difference in preservation between, say, Yosemite and Yellowstone. Yosemite is looking much higher change than Yellowstone, higher change in terms of the whole water cycle changing and thus the whole landscape changing. There's more hope for relative preservation in Yellowstone than in Yosemite. Folks, let's round it up. If you're in Wyoming, don't worry that you're becoming a particularly attractive destination. Wyoming is only getting more wild. Anyone who wants to move up there by you, your intense climate will be a shock that will only increase. You don't have so much water or ability to grow food, so I don't know that Wyoming's population should grow all that much. But if this land speaks to you, it's 100% a place I would advocate digging in. Right now, the fossil fuel industry is by far the largest employer in the state, both directly and by providing for other jobs downstream. Thinking about the future, this sure looks like a place where you could get a lot of wind power in. And speaking from Iowa, we're #1 in wind and wind growth. It can be very positive for landowners and those jobs. They can be good jobs that support a family. This is a lower change forecast than Wyoming was facing in the NCA4. Idaho looked better and you looked worse in the NCA4. You two kind of flipped places in the NCA5 projections. And when I say you look good, Wyoming, that this is lower change, it's important we be clear. This is not reducing the current level of chaos energy in Wyoming. It's just increasing it less than we might have expected, staying a little more like things are today. I think Cheyenne might see some interesting growth in the next 10 years. I think we might see a little more landscape stability in Wyoming than some of us might have feared. And we see that foreshadowed in the lower spread of invasive species into Wyoming than we've seen in some nearby states in the region so far. Honestly, I am more hopeful about Wyoming's beautiful natural areas than I was before looking carefully through the NCA5 for this state. I'm more hopeful for the future of the many life forms in Wyoming's big wild ecosystems. You're looking at more water in Wind River, less water in the Bighorns, more heat to the east, but maybe enough water to compensate. And in the Western Mountains, crazier storms and shorter winters. There's a higher fire risk all around, centered in the Bighorns. But no matter what the challenge, there are margins worth holding all around the state. I'm rooting for you, Wyoming. Let's get ready. Thanks for watching. And I want to thank everyone in the AR community for your contributions. They're keeping this nonprofit rolling and growing. If you want to donate, there's a link on the About page of our YouTube channel or on the top bar of our website, www.americanresiliency.org. I'm very grateful to our donors, to our volunteers, to everyone spreading the word online, and especially to everyone doing the work on the ground. As a special note, I'm on the lookout for a solid climate data set for Mexico. I think more and more of us are wanting a Mexico overview. If you've got a lead, email me at ar@americanresiliency.org. Thanks for getting ready with me and talk with you again soon.